Hello, welcome to this week's episode of Mayor Brown's Quick Insights on Congressional Investigations. I'm Andrew Olman, a former Republican chief counsel at the Senate Banking Committee. I'm joined by my colleague Michael Levy, a white-collar defense attorney. Each week we answer a question about congressional investigations relevant to in-house counsel and government affairs professionals. This week's question is, what's the worst thing that can happen in a congressional investigation? Michael?
Well, Andrew, obviously a lot of bad things can happen in a congressional investigation, but when I start to think about the ones that we've seen that have caused the most damage, I really think there are sort of three types of harm. The first one is obviously reputational harm. As we've talked about, because of Congress's ability to access and use the media so effectively, both individuals and companies can suffer very significant reputational damage in congressional investigations. We've seen individuals who have spent decades building up their careers and reputations embarrassed at public hearings to the point where they've lost their jobs, had their careers destroyed. We've seen companies that have been around for more than a century have their reputations harmed so severely that even today, they still haven't recovered years later. Particularly in public hearings, members of Congress want to make news. They're politicians. They're running for office. They're running for re-election. They're running for higher office. They want to get attention. And if embarrassing you or embarrassing your company is a way to do that, they're not going to hesitate. So you need to be well represented and well prepared in order to avoid that reputational harm. The second kind of harm that I think about is the kind of harm that can happen that arises directly from the way you handle the congressional investigation. And these are the kinds of risks you want to avoid in any government investigation. Things like making false statements to the government. Obviously, you would like to avoid facing a criminal prosecution for lying to Congress. And the third kind of harm is really interesting. It's when you face some kind of major legal consequence in a different forum. And that has been put into place or set in motion, sometimes even accelerated by a congressional investigation. So, for example, documents that have been provided to a congressional committee that find their way to a plaintiff's lawyer in civil litigation, or jury pools that are influenced and sometimes influenced irreparably by the media narrative that's generated through a congressional investigation, particularly a highly public one. Even more significantly, I think you need to keep in mind that congressional committees can and do refer matters to the Department of Justice and other regulatory enforcement agencies for further investigation and prosecution beyond the congressional investigation. And in doing so, the congressional committee can hand those regulatory enforcement agencies or the Department of Justice an entire roadmap with all of the documents that they've discovered and how to build their case. It's dangerous. I can think of at least one prominent entity that probably never would have had to contend with a major DOJ investigation and wind up paying hundreds of millions of dollars, had it not so antagonized and so annoyed Senate investigators that the committee in question not only made a referral to DOJ and provided DOJ with tons of documents, but actually affirmatively pushed DOJ to take action. They were so upset at what the entity had done in the investigation. So from my perspective, the bottom line in all of these worst case scenarios is that while you certainly need to push back against congressional investigators at times, you need to be sure that you do so in a way that will avoid incurring even more costly consequences, whether those are reputational, legal, or both. You can and should push back, but you need to do so thoughtfully. You need to do so strategically, or you risk some pretty significant damage.
And I think that's generally right, Michael. I would add actually a fourth risk, which is getting legislation that is adverse to your company or an industry, or just simply bad public policy. Because oftentimes congressional investigations are done to make sure that Congress has a good record on which to legislate. And I know in my experience at Senate Banking, oftentimes, and actually most of the times when we conducted investigations, it was to make sure that when we were going to legislate, we had the right information, we were going to move public policy in an appropriate way based on the best facts. And if you're not able, as a staffer, able to get those facts, it's much harder to make sure the legislation is appropriately drafted. And sometimes we actually found companies were so reluctant to constructively engage with us, it made the legislative function of our committee much more difficult to do. And it wasn't intended to be an adversarial relationship. It was a good faith effort by us to get information so we could help the members of the committee make good decisions. So I think there's always that balance on how to be constructive and understanding how the investigation is going to be used when you're thinking about responding to inquiries from a congressional committee. So, well, that's this week episode. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.